it sounds like such a simple thing, but I don't think truth tends to be that complicated. And so when you look at someone like Charlie, he has this incredible ability to simplify and to say, yeah, so if you want a good spouse, deserve one. If you want a good partner, be one. And so as with investing, Charlie says it's simple, not easy. These truths are not that complicated, but when you discover them, you want to go big on them.
Hello, listeners. My name is Raj Singhal, and welcome to another episode of Breaking Investment Stereotypes. Here we deconstruct world-class investors or wealth managers and deep dive into their investing journey, professionally, personally, or both. This episode is brought to you by multiply.co, where we believe that investing is an ignored life skill. Our mission is to create a platform where people can find fellow investors, discover investing products, and share investing ideas. We have now gone live and thousands of users are already part of a vibrant community. So do check out our app, which is there both on Apple Store and Play Store, or simply just sign up on web. I want to give a little guidance on how to use the shows. None of the following should be taken as an investment advice. Please see multiply.co/disclosures for more information. I have a special guest today, and my guest is William Green. William Green is the author of a very popular book, Richer, Wiser, Happier: How the World's Greatest Investors Win in Markets and Life. Over the last quarter of a century, he has interviewed many of the world's best investors, exploring in depth the question of what qualities and insights enable them to achieve enduring success. He's written extensively about investing for many publications and also given many talks about the lessons we can learn from the most successful investors, not only about how to invest, but also how to improve our thinking. Green has written for many leading publications in the US and Europe, including New Yorker, Times, Fortune, Forbes, Barron's, Bloomberg Markets, and The Economist. He has reported in places as diverse as China, India, Japan, Philippines, Bangladesh, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and many more. He has interviewed presidents and prime ministers, including Arun Manmohan Singh, inventors, criminals, prize-winning authors, the CEOs of the world's largest company, and countless billionaires. He has also worked closely with renowned hedge fund manager Guy Spear, helping him to write his much appraised 2014 memoir, The Education of a Value Investor: My Transformative Quest for Wealth, Wisdom, and Enlightenment. Green also wrote and edited The Greatest Minds of Investing, which features short profiles of 33 renowned investors, along with stunning portraits created by Michael O'Brien, one of the America's preeminent photographers. Born and raised in London, Green was educated at Eton College, studied English literature at Oxford University, and received a master's degree from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. He lives in New York right now with his wife, Lauren, and their children, Henry and Madeline. So without further ado, please welcome William Green. Hey, William, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. So let's start about you, William. You started very early at the age of 20 and become really obsessed with investing. You got into journalism and you traveled 3,000 miles to LA just for a 10-minute interview with Charlie Munger. Tell us more about you and what gave you the idea of interviewing great investors?
Well, I think probably it's partly because I'm slightly lazy, and I always had this fantasy of making lots of money without having to work too hard. And so when I was a teenager, I started to gamble on horses when I was about 15. And I ruined my 16th birthday because I couldn't believe that my parents were so unreasonable that they wouldn't buy me a subscription to this very pricey gambling system that would help me to make better bets on horses. And so I think even then, I was at Eton, right, with people like Boris Johnson and David Cameron, two of the last three British prime ministers. And so while everyone else was rowing on the river and playing cricket and trying to become a proper English gentleman, I was there in this turf accountant in Windsor, near Windsor Castle, where the Queen lived, trying to figure out how to make money off horses. And I ended up, not surprisingly, losing money betting on horses. And then I thought, well, this is a lousy game. I'm not going to do this. And so I stopped cold turkey, and I've never gambled on horses, dogs, anything like that. I'd never go to a casino. And then when I was in my 20s, I discovered the stock market. And I just thought, this is fabulous. This really is the game that I wanted to play all of this time. And I had no idea how it worked at all. But I came into a little bit of money, not a huge amount by any means, in I guess my mid-20s, because my brother and I had owned an apartment together in London that we sold. And so then I start reading very passionately about the stock market and mutual funds and the like. And I think it reawakened that gambling instinct that I'd had as a lazy, indolent teenager, with this fantasy of not having to get my hands dirty, not having to work too hard, just exercising my mind. And the idea that you can get rich and become financially independent just by thinking well, actually, I think does turn out to be true. I think it's much harder work than I ever imagined, which is a shame. But I do think it's one of those areas in life where if you think well, you can become financially independent. You can become financially secure. You can bankroll your other habits in life. So the fact that I want to write and read and think and talk is made possible by the fact that I studied the stock market. And so to some degree, my fantasy came true. But also, I think what I kind of discovered over the years is that I don't really personally have the makings of not even a great investor, but not even a very good investor, because part of what happened to me over the years is that I got to interview all of these great investors, and I could just see how much better equipped they were for this game than I am. So I've ended up in some strange way becoming an interpreter of the great investors and explaining what they can do and why it is that they win. But the sad discovery is that actually I'm not one of them, and I don't have their calmness and their dispassionate temperament, and also I do think they're fanatically driven. A lot of these guys, I'm afraid they do tend to be guys, not women, and I, that's above my pay grade, but we can talk about that more. But I do think when I look at most of these great investors, they're just fanatically driven. So the idea that you can somehow be lazy and get vastly rich is probably a disproven fantasy at this point. When I think of someone like Will Danoff, who I wrote about in my book, who managed over $200 billion at Fidelity and had this amazing record over the last 30 years. And Bill Miller, one of the great fund managers, told me that when he first met Will Danoff about 30 years ago, someone introduced him, and Bill Miller, who's a very affable, nice guy, extends his hand and says, "Hi, Will." And Will Danoff doesn't extend his hand and just says, "I'm going to beat you, man. I'm going to beat you." So I do think you need that kind of intensity to be extraordinary at anything.
No, awesome. I mean, and thanks for being the interpreter for the whole world, for meeting those guys and telling us more about you, which brings us to your book. And I think Rolf Dobley, who's the author of Art of Thinking Clearly, says your book, Richer, Wiser, Happier, not only teaches you how to invest, it teaches you how to think. And I completely agree with that, right? Because I've read the book. Tell us more about the book itself. What made you write this book?
Well, I think part of what happened is when I was in my mid-20s, to rewind the story a bit, I started writing for these magazines like Forbes and Fortune, Money, later Time Magazine, Barron's, and the like. And so I would get to interview all of these famous investors. And so early on, I was just thinking, this is great. I can figure out how to get rich by going off and interviewing people like Sir John Templeton in the Bahamas, or Marty Whitman here in New York, who was one of the great curmudgeonly contrarian value investors, just a brilliant guy. Fayez Sarafim, who was known as the Sphinx, who was this Egyptian billionaire who just died recently, who was living in Houston and had an El Greco painting in his office. I mean, incredibly rare art. And he'd imported I think a 5th century Syrian mosaic from a Syrian church that was his floor in his office in Houston, Texas. So I was getting to interview these amazing people. And then I got kind of waylaid, and I went and did other stuff as well. So I ended up editing the Asian edition of Time Magazine. And like you, I lived in Hong Kong for a while. And I would report in India. I would do things like go interview Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in India for time, and I would go interview presidents and prime ministers in places like Bangladesh and Poland and all of these places. It was an amazing time, and then I drifted back into finance. Excuse me, and then I drifted back into financial journalism after many years, and I wrote a book called The Great Minds of Investing, and that included something like 21 profiles by me of great investors. So I I got to meet all of these new great investors that I hadn't met early on. And so early on, I'd interviewed people like Peter Lynch and Jack Bogle, the founder of Vanguard. Then I started interviewing all of these extraordinary people for this book, The Great Minds of Investing. And I started thinking, I actually have something kind of extraordinary here that possibly nobody else in the world has. I mean, it's possible that someone has that I don't know, but I had 25 years basically of incredible interviews with these extraordinary people that I'd kind of stockpiled. And I start to think, well, there's a lot more going on here than just teaching us how to get rich. Actually, I can see from the interviews that I've done with people like Howard Marks, who your listeners will know manages something like $160 billion at Oaktree, he oversees. I could see these are very interesting thinkers, or Charlie Munger, Buffett's partner. They're engaged in this whole pursuit of what John Maynard Keynes called worldly wisdom. And I started to think, what if I could take the best of the interviews that I had from 20 years ago, 25 years ago, combine them with what I've learned more recently, combine them with everything that I've read over the years about Buddhism, Stoicism, Kabbalah, all of these different forms of spiritual and philosophical wisdom, and then go interview the most interesting people that I've interviewed over the years, again, in greater depth. So go back and interview Howard Marks again, go interview people like Ed Thorpe, who is one of the greatest investors and greatest gamblers of all time, the guy who figured out card counting and the like. And so I just thought, that would be really interesting. I should double down on this. And so I started going kind of crazy, and I went and interviewed more than 40 people for the book, more than 40 great investors. And I would do things like, I would literally spend 5 days in India with Monish Pabrai. So I would be combining that with interviews that I'd done with him in Irvine, California. I'd been to Omaha for the Berkshire Hathaway meeting with him a couple of times. So I just had this crazy amount of information. I'd have had dinners with him in New York City. So in a way, the stakes got higher and higher, because the deeper I got into this thing, the more I realized I have something that's actually totally unique. Nobody can replicate this. And so let me not mess this up. Let me actually try to synthesize and distill this stuff and try to distill what I've learned, not only about how to invest and how to get rich, but actually about how to think, about how you handle these very profound questions, like the fact that the future is unknowable, and yet we have to make decisions about the future. And so what I started to figure out is that there's something fundamentally different about great investors than about the rest of us, that they have so much skin in the game, they have so much money riding on their decisions, that it forces them to become extremely good thinkers. So if you're a journalist like me, or you're a professor of economics, or you're a market strategist making bogus predictions about the direction of the market that all of us know are nonsense, and basically you're just putting your finger in the wind and praying that you can tell which direction the wind is going. There's not much downside for being wrong. But if you have hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars at stake, you better be right. And so there's something about the stakes, the amount you can lose and the amount you can gain, that forces these people to think extraordinarily well. And so what they do is they go around the world looking for different ways of thinking that can give them an advantage. So if they see something in mindfulness meditation, that they're like, oh yeah, that could make me calmer so that I can think more clearly. Or they see something in Buddhist philosophy, in Zen Buddhism, like Howard Marks saw, and he says, oh, so the Zen Buddhists teach that everything changes, nothing stays the same. And so that applies to markets. So I better learn to accommodate myself to reality as it is, because everything is changing. So instead of predicting what's going to happen, let me focus on reality as it is and adjust to that. So they're taking these ideas from everywhere and adapting them to what they do. So they became this extraordinary filter for me to view the world. So it becomes almost like an investor's guide to life. You're looking at people like Munger and saying, what can I learn not only about how to invest better, but actually how to think better and how to live more wisely? This is the world's most long-winded answer, but I hope it points us in the right direction.
No. I mean, I really loved it. You brought it very, very actually simply, I would say. So you have interviewed close to probably about 50 of the greatest investors in the world, right, in the last 20, 25 years. So let's talk about, what are the most important things you would have learned from them by interviewing them. How do those people defy gravity by actually beating index, right? I mean, a lot of them actually do that over a long period. What characters, principles, traits, habits they have?
I think one of the things that I figured out is that there are ways of tilting the odds in your favor in life where you can systematically operate in a more intelligent way, a more rational way that doesn't ensure that you're going to win, because there's still a huge element of randomness and luck. But if you behave stupidly over the long term, it's likely to go badly wrong. And if you behave intelligently and rationally, you're tilting the odds in your favor. And I started to look for all of these different ways in which the great investors are doing this. So think of someone like Munger as an example. So the chapter that I write about Munger is really about how to reduce what Munger calls standard stupidities. And so here you have one of the smartest guys on earth saying, it's actually really hard to be smart. It's really hard to be smarter. But surprisingly, it turns out to be relatively easy to avoid stupidity. So what Munger said is, if you can avoid idiocy, if you can just be non-idiotic and live a long time, you're going to beat almost everybody. So I started to sift through everything that Munger had written and said over the years to think about, okay, how is it that he's reducing standard stupidities? And then when I went to interview him, I said, Charlie, I regard you as the grand master of stupidity reduction. And can you explain to me why you take that approach? And he says, yeah, because it works. It works. It's as simple as that. And so here you have Munger, who says, he has this beautiful line where he says, I observe what works and doesn't work and why. And so Munger is this perfect embodiment of a great investor, taking different ways of thinking and operating from different intellectual disciplines and applying them to investing. So one of the things he did is he studies mathematics, and he discovers this guy Carl Gustav Jacobi, this great 19th century algebraist. And I can count to possibly 7. So my knowledge of when I start talking about algebra, that I'm on very rocky ground. But so what Carl Gustav Jacobi famously said is invert, always invert. And so what Munger does is he takes this idea of inversion and he says, let me apply this to investing in life, which means you're solving problems backwards. So if, for example, you want to say, how can I become a great investor? You start by saying, well, let me figure out how I can become a terrible investor. And so you start to look at all of the dumb mistakes that terrible investors make. And that includes us, because I think most of us, even if we're smart investors, have made our fair share of incredibly stupid mistakes. And so what Charlie does is, almost as a hobby, he collects examples of what he calls asininities and inanities. And so, for example, you think about the ways that people have screwed up recently that were all incredibly consistent with the way they screwed up in 1999, 2000. So you remember in 1999, 2000, when I was a young financial journalist writing for Forbes and their Money magazine, you could see people rolling the dice on idiotic IPOs of dot-com companies that were trading at ridiculous prices. And they were operating as if these things were going to shoot to the sky. And people like Buffett were looked on as morons and fossils who had slowly lost their touch because they were too old and too committed to the old paradigm of wanting to own businesses that actually made money and were profitable and would grow and had sustainable competitive advantages, which sounded so archaic. It sounded like, well, why doesn't this idiot understand the beauty of this new paradigm of these .com stocks? And so here again, this recent period, you've seen all of these people saying, yeah, I should invest in these NFTs, these tokens that give me a right to own a picture of a gorilla. And so it's all just sort of the greater fool theory, right? It goes back to tulip mania in, what was it, 17th century Holland. So these are things where people get caught up in fads again and again and again. So it's human nature repeating itself. So just this simple idea of looking at the standard stupidities, there's so many examples, and just saying, let me not do that, turns out to be incredibly powerful. But to me, the beauty of it is that something like this principle applies just as well to life. So you can also say, I gave an example of this recently where I was coming back from a dinner with a great investor, and we drank a couple of bottles of wine. And I get to the train station, and it's like a 6-minute drive to my house. And I'd left my car at the train station. And I'm thinking, am I drunk or not? And I'm like, no, I think I'm absolutely fine. But you're just looking at it and thinking, but I know that if I've drunk too much, I don't have good judgment. And how can I judge whether I'm entirely sober or not? And what's the downside if I'm wrong? What if I get stopped? What if I hit someone, God forbid? And so you're just looking at situations like that, and you're saying, that's a standard stupidity, to do things when your judgment is impaired by alcohol, heavy emotion, anger, jealousy, all of these things. And so you just say, okay, these are ways in which people screw up. Let me at least not do that. So I phoned my son, who at the time was living with us, who is now is 24, then he was, I guess, 23. And it's midnight, and he comes and picks me up. And it's kind of embarrassing. And then the next morning, I forget that my car is at the train station and leave it there. But at least I avoided this standard stupidity of doing something with a very minimal upside and a massive downside. So if you behave that way throughout your life, reducing things that have colossal downside, unlimited upside, you're subtly tilting the odds in your favor.
Awesome. I mean, I think Rory Sutherland said that, right? The world is full of probabilistic outcomes, where actually as a human being, we are more tuned to thinking in more black and white, or, this way or the other way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, that's just to talk about in continuation of what you said about, right, avoiding stupidity. And I think you speak a lot about, when talking to some of the greatest investors, about this art of subtraction, right? So how did that rule help you impact your life? How did that, tell us more about that?
Yeah, the art of subtraction, I think I probably stole the phrase from somewhere. I don't think it was me who invented this by any means, but it became a very important principle for me that I think actually, if you go back to Lao Tzu, whose name I'm definitely mispronouncing, he talked about how wise people are subtracting things, whereas most people are adding things to their lives. And if you think about most of our lives at the moment, there's so much complexity to them. There's so much busyness. And I fall prey to this the whole time, right? I feel at the moment particularly bombarded by Twitter messages and LinkedIn messages and appointments, and I have a very scattered mind. I have the mind of a writer, which is all over the place. I mean, if you look at my bookshelf here, and you can't even see the books over here, it's all kind of spilling over. Ideas are spilling over, and it's hard to control things. And so part of what I figured out about what the greatest investors were doing is that they're subtracting things from their lives. They're removing complexity. And so I think one of the habits that you want to try to develop in life, that I've certainly tried and to a great extent failed to develop in my own life, is this habit of consistent subtraction, to say, let me do less. More and more obligations just lead you to to operate in this very shallow, superficial way. And so for me, the way I apply this in my life is partly just to say, for example, okay, everyone else who does a podcast wants to do a podcast once a week. Let me do it once every couple of weeks. Maybe I should be doing it once a month. Everyone else wants to knock out a book every couple of years. I spent 5 years working on this book, possibly longer, because it was also based on interviews from many years before. So I'm actually trying to do less, but go deeper and do it really to the best of my capability. And what's tricky about it, it makes tremendous sense, I think, to go deep and do less and to focus in a very distracted world. But I find myself immediately kind of tumbling into this very superficial way of operating, where once you engage with the world, it's very hard to disengage. And so part of the challenge that I'm dealing with at the moment is I have this new podcast, the Richer, Wiser, Happier podcast. So I've been interviewing people like Ray Dalio and Howard Marks and Joe Greenblatt and lots of other great investors. And then what's wonderful is you can share it with the world on Twitter and LinkedIn, and you don't have the traditional gatekeepers like Time Magazine, where I used to work. You don't, or the New York Times or something. You don't have to go through the gatekeepers. You can connect directly with your audience. But once you start to reply to everyone on Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and stuff like that, you're operating in this very short-term way, and you're getting these dopamine hits from people liking stuff and people connecting with you and people writing to you. And it's really wonderful. And I love the connection with the audience. It's a really wonderful thing. You're building the tribe, but at the same time, you're falling into this trap of more and more complexity in your life. And it makes it really hard to do deep work. And so this is just an ongoing tension. And in the next episode of my podcast, I talked to my friend Guy Spear about exactly this problem. And I'm saying to him, how do you deal with it? And he's like, look, not well. And so I think you just have to be aware that there's this tremendous tension that's mounting for all of us between the possibility of engaging in the world in all these new ways, getting limitless information from the internet, from all of the sources that are now available, the kind of flattening of the world, the fact that you and I can talk with me here in New York and you there in India. It's just a wonderful thing. There are possibilities that have never been available before. But at the same time, a lot of it is pushing us towards superficiality and quick dopamine hits. And I when I look at the greatest investors, and I look at people like Nick Sleep, for example, who I write about in a chapter about him and his partner, Case Zakaria, they were very consciously reducing information that they regarded as having a short shelf life and focusing on information that had a long shelf life. So part of their competitive advantage was literally to say, here's everyone else focusing on the daily news, on what this latest report means for inflation. Or I remember Zach giving me this example where he said, look, there's an article in the Financial Times this morning saying the economy, it's going to rebound in the shape of a Nike swoosh or a K or a V, or, and he's like, it's just nonsense. He's like, it's just, people are so focused on this short-term nonsense. And I remember Nick Sleep saying to me, everyone's focused on what he called wiggle guessing. So what's this going to mean for the stock in the short term over the next day or two, or the economy or the market in the next day or two? And so what they were doing is they were focusing very consciously on the long term. So they were subtracting all of this short-term noise and focusing on questions like, will this business that we're analyzing have an extraordinary destination in 10, 15, 20 years? And are they pursuing the kind of inputs now that will build toward that incredible destination? So they would analyze a company like Amazon, which became an enormous position for them to a point where in their personal portfolios, it got to more than 70% of their net worth. And they would say, are they treating customers in a way that's building towards this incredible destination? Are they driving down costs? Are they becoming more and more efficient? Are they adding more and more value? Are they treating their suppliers okay? All of these things. Are they cutting costs constantly? within their headquarters, within their warehouses. And so they were focusing on what they would call destination analysis, these very long-term questions, whereas most people are focusing on the short term. So I think if there's a takeaway here, it's that the rest of us want to remove more and more of the noise, more of the short-term nonsense, more of the dopamine hits, and defer gratification, lengthen our focus, so that we're looking at these long-term destinations. And you can do this in every area of life. So I was talking to my daughter the other day, who's 21, and she was saying she had an injury about a year ago where she hurt her hip badly and had hip surgery. And she's become very conscious of how to keep fit and how to exercise and how to build her strength. And she's thinking very consciously of what she's going to be like in old age and how to operate now in a way that's going to build her strength and her posture and things. And there's a fascinating doctor, a guy called Peter Attia here in New York, who talks about the centenarian Olympics. And so he's invented this term, as I understand it, where he's thinking, what do I want to be able to do when I'm 100 years old? And what are the inputs now that will get me there? So if I want to be able to walk up the stairs with a bag of groceries, and I want to be able to pick up my great-grandchildren, and I want to be able to stand upright and not have really bad arthritis, what do I need to do in terms of strength training, in terms of stretching, in terms of my posture, in terms of my diet? And so again, this is a principle, the art of subtraction, that actually radiates out in all of these different areas, because it forces you to think about what you can remove rather than what you can add. And so then you start to focus on what really matters. So and I think what really matters on the whole is the long-term destination and what's going to get you there. So then you start to think, okay, so why do you meditate, for example? It's not going to do you much good on that particular day necessarily, maybe a little bit of good, maybe it'll calm you down or something, but you meditate over 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and the impact is overwhelming. So I think what you want to do is look at the different areas of your life and say, what really matters to me? What am I really optimizing for? What kind of person do I want to be in 10, 15, 20 years? And am I doing the things that are going to get me there? And what can I remove? And one of the things that the greatest investors remove is anything that they're not really good at. So they're just not interested in trying to play games that they're mediocre at. And so there's this very intense focus on what you're good at and what you love. And so I would encourage your listeners to go through your life and think about kind of the main buckets in your life. Okay, so I was talking to Guy Spira again about this last week. And he was saying, yeah, so it's like family, his relationship with his wife, his relationship with his 3 kids, his hedge fund, his business, his employees, his charitable stuff, his spiritual life, his health, his fitness. And so it's very idiosyncratic and personal for each of us. But I would go through and figure out, here are the main things, here's where I want to go, and here's what I can remove, so that I'm not frittering away my life on nonsense like wiggle guessing and what's complicated. None of this is simple. For someone like me who wants to build a tribe around ideas who are going to benefit from all of these ideas, I do have to engage with the world. I have to engage on Twitter, and I kind of love it. But I have to be aware that there's a tension, and that it pushes me towards superficial work instead of the kind of deep work that involves you sitting quietly in your study for years, bashing your head against your computer, trying to figure out what you can learn from these greatest investors. And so there's just a tension here, but knowing what the most successful people do, and that they're removing rather than adding complexity, I think it's a very helpful idea.
I think there's some great insights there, and I'm actually one of the non-intuitive thing I've realized over life is that, and you mentioned that, is that you should always double down on your strength rather than going after your weakness. I think there is a great merit in that.
Yeah, I was talking to my daughter about this again the other day, and she was talking about that she discovered that there was an architecture teacher at her high school, And she said, I was so busy doing remedial math that I was never going to be good at, that I never got to study architecture, which she would have been amazing at. Yeah. And it's one of the great flaws of our educational system, I think, that often we focus on the things that we're bad at rather than trying to become extraordinary at the things that we're good at. And I think that the greatest investors are somewhat ruthless about this. Yeah. I remember Charlie Munger saying, when someone was asking him for career advice, he said, look, if you're 5'3", don't become a basketball player. Yeah. You'll be competing against people who are 7'9". And so you have to find something that really plays to your skills. And then you focus on it with some degree of maniacal fervor. And so I do think you have to get good in a narrow area. And partly at school, it's difficult because you need to go fairly broad. So in case you stumble upon something that you might absolutely love that you could miss otherwise. So, but at the same time, really focus narrowly so you can become extraordinary at what you're good at. But someone like Howard Marks, for example, just got lucky at Wharton when he got thrown out of an art class because he loved art, but they were like, how can you study art when you're a finance student? And so he was looking for another subject to minor in, and he stumbles into a Japanese studies class. And that was where he discovers this idea of mujo, which is this Zen Buddhist idea that everything changes. And that, I mean, he believes that was key to him becoming a multi-billionaire, basically, like this one recognition of things changing and how you deal with the fact that markets and everything else are changing. So again, nothing is simple, right? You need to go narrow and really focus on what you're good at, but you need to cast the net wide enough so that you might stumble upon the thing in a Japanese studies class that will change your life. And so I do think there are these tensions there. You have to subtract stuff, but you also have to add stuff and expand your circle of competence. You have to be really aware of your own strengths, but you also have to build in areas where you're weak. So it's just complicated. None of it is really very simple.
Yeah. You brought in the topic of luck from Howard Marks, right? And I think you also spoke about Nick Sleep and Zach getting into investing by accidents, both of them, right? So clearly Nomad was born out of an accident. You can say that. How do we talk, in while interviewing such people, and while they have great insights and they behave in such a way which increases their probability of success, how do we talk about luck playing a role in the way they have or whatever success they have achieved, including like Nick Sleep and Zach and Howard Marks and whatever those people?
I think luck plays a huge role. It's not enough. You need to be very hardworking. You need to be talented. You need to be driven. But Howard was very candid about the degree to which luck has played a role in his career. So I'll give you a beautiful example of it in Howard's career, which is, well, for a start, he didn't really think he was destined for Wharton. He thought he wasn't really qualified to get into Wharton, and the other university he was applying to was a state college that wouldn't have had anything like that prestige and would have made it pretty much impossible for him to launch that kind of financial career. So from the very start, he was lucky with college, and he came from a family where neither of his parents went to college. And he said, look, I was lucky that my parents, even though they didn't go to college, they really believed in education, and they got me an encyclopedia. And he was lucky to be born at the time he was, which is at the end of World War II, when there was a tremendous boom. He was lucky to be born as a white middle-class Jewish kid from a family that really cared about education and about the opportunities that he would have if he built his mind. Lucky to ride this incredible period of economic growth in the U.S. economy, one of the great periods in global history of economic growth. Then when he gets out of Wharton, he's applying for all of these jobs, and he said the one thing I really knew is I really wanted to take this job at Lehman Brothers. And basically, he applies to this job. He has his interviews. He's really confident. He knows it's going to be a great job. And he doesn't ever get the call to tell him that he's been hired. So he goes to work elsewhere and builds his career as an analyst, I think at a company that became Citigroup, if I remember rightly. And he said he discovered years later that the partner at Lehman Brothers, who was supposed to call him to tell him that they'd offered him the job, got drunk and had a hangover and failed to call him. So he said, if that guy hadn't been drunk and hadn't had a hangover, what if I had gone to Lehman Brothers, which then I would have built my career there. And when it went under in 2008, 2009, during the global financial crisis, I might have lost all of my savings. And, who knows what would have happened. Yeah. So for Howard, the awareness that he's been lucky in all of these ways is hugely important because it keeps him humble. And so it saves him from what I call master of the universe syndrome, where you start to think that you're so smart, you're so brilliant, that you've cracked it, that you've cracked the code. And I think the markets are so brutal that people who overestimate themselves, who have overconfidence, tend to come a cropper sooner or later. The market exposes our character flaws sooner or later, whether it's greed, laziness, jealousy, impatience, fearfulness, overconfidence. And so I think for Howard, he has the confidence of someone who knows he's highly intelligent. But even there, he says, look, the fact that I have a high IQ, even that's lucky. I did nothing to deserve a high IQ, Howard says. And so the fact that he's constantly aware of his luck saves him from overconfidence. But it also actually makes him happier, because he goes around and saying, what a lucky guy I am. And I think that's kind of lovely. Again, it's one of these areas where I think you can take something from the microcosm of investing in the markets, and you can apply it in other areas of your life. So you can say, well, if I actually go around thinking, God, how fortunate I am, how blessed I am, how lucky I am, you're going to have a better life than if you go around thinking, I can't believe the world doesn't appreciate how wonderful I am. And I can't believe this schmuck who's less talented and less smart than I am has been more successful. And so I think it's a great way to operate, to believe that you're lucky.
Awesome. What's like meeting all these billionaires, right? I mean, I think you mentioned that, there's a combination of arrogance, pride, vulnerability, and fragility in all of them, right? How do we explain all of that? And, tell us more about them. Well, many people don't end up meeting any billionaire, right? So you met many of them.
They're so idiosyncratic and all so different. And I end the book with this epilogue where I wrote about, among other people, about Bill Miller, who I've spent the best part of 100 hours interviewing over the last 20 something years. And so one of the things that I was doing in writing about Bill in that chapter was talking about just how brutal the period of the financial crisis had been for him, just how painful it had been when basically his assets under management went from something like $77 billion to $800 million, and 100 people got laid off because of analytical mistakes that he made. And what I wanted to show is, here's this brilliant guy, unbelievably talented, really decent guy, and very, very rich, very successful, and he went through hell. And I wanted to show people that just because you're immensely rich and immensely smart and immensely successful doesn't mean you don't suffer in the way that the rest of us suffer. And in a way, I was trying to explore in some ways this great Buddhist truth, right? The truth that and look, I'm no great expert on this, but the truth of dukkha, of suffering, the fact that everyone suffers. And I'm trying to say, here's this guy, Bill Miller, who does everything right. He comes from basically a pretty poor family. He's the son of a taxi driver, grew up with no money. When he was a kid, it was a treat for them to go to Burger King for his birthday. And through sheer brilliance, ends up becoming this billionaire, ends up becoming this legend, beats the market for 15 years running with his mutual fund, which nobody has ever done. I mean, it's an unprecedented act of brilliance. And then comes totally undone during the financial crisis, and everyone pillories him. and shames him. I remember him showing me this message at one point on Twitter where he had this amazing recovery after the financial crisis, where he had an extraordinary decade of returns after the financial crisis, after everyone had written him off. And someone writes this tweet where I think Bill was in, the top. He was the top performing fund of the year, and he had this amazing rebound. And someone says that asshat Bill Miller is just going to come undone again and bankrupt everyone or something. And he's like, this guy who doesn't know me, he's calling me an asshat. He's like, that's kind of harsh. And so what I was trying to show is, in a way, the humanity of someone like Bill worrying about the fact that all of these employees who were dependent on him had lost their jobs because of a mistake that he made. And he said, look, I put on 40 pounds during that period. And I said to him, how come? And he said, because I was doing comfort eating. He said, I would get Chinese takeaway food and I would drink wine with my dinner. And he said, I could have been eating broccoli and salmon and drinking Perrier, but he said, a man can only take so much pain. And so I wanted to show, in a way, the fact that the people who are super rich, yeah, they're different in some ways, but they're still dealing with the same issues as I am. And that's really comforting in a strange way. I mean, I remember talking to someone about this a few years back, and they were like, oh yeah, cry me a river. And I was like, no, it's really comforting to know when you're going through a difficult period that everybody I've written about has gone through really painful periods. And so these are people who've had daughters with bulimia and anorexia. They've had kids with locked-in syndrome, where you can only communicate by blinking. They've lost spouses. They've suffered public humiliation and failure when they've underperformed. They have immense stress. They don't really have control, in a way, over their returns. So they work unbelievably hard. They're incredibly competitive. And they're being judged the whole time on something that in the short term they don't have control over, which, as one guy, Jason Karp, said to me, is basically that's a way that you can induce insanity in lab animals by having them kind of pull a lever, and sometimes it gives them an electric shock and sometimes it gives them a treat. And he said that's basically what the stock market is doing. It's a very painful mechanism. And so this is helpful, because then when you're going through a difficult period, you're like, well, this is just part of the human condition. And part of what I was showing and writing about Bill Miller is the immense drew from Stoic philosophy, where he was saying, well, look, I can't control my reputation. I can't control what people say about me, but I can control my own intentions and my own noble actions and my own attempt to keep going and to earn back the money for the people who lost it and who trusted me and who stayed with me. And he did that to an extraordinary degree over the next decade. And so part of what I was trying to say is there are two great lessons in his story. One is everyone suffers. Yeah. And one is that there's great nobility in the simple virtue of perseverance. And that to me, I'm not saying that in a glib, superficial way. There are times where I've been having a difficult time over the last year, and I would read that chapter and I'd be like, oh, yeah, the simple virtue of perseverance. And it's a reminder. You look at these people who've been through the ringer and you say, okay, well, let me control what I can control. It's one of the great truths of Stoic philosophy, that you focus on what you can control, and the rest you kind of have to let go of.
Awesome. Charlie Munger, right? I mean, I think you've written a lot about him. We spoke about avoiding stupidity, and I've started believing a lot in that. It sounds very lame, but I think it's a great way of looking life, Lord. What drives him? I mean, the man is like 97, 98, and and also more importantly, I want to bring in the whole partnership between Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, right? Of a 50-year or more than 50 years of partnership. What drives those people? What drives their partnership?
Well, I thought it was very interesting when I went to LA to interview Munger, and at the end of the Daily Journal meeting, I interviewed him before the Daily Journal meeting, and at the end there was this long Q&A session, and I stayed and I kept asking questions because I wanted to extend this, and I asked him what we can learn from him and Warren about having a happy life. And what was interesting was he immediately starts talking about relationships. And he didn't say, well, it's all due to relationships. He just immediately turned to the subject of relationships. And he said, we've worked with the most wonderful people. And he said, I've been a good partner to Warren, and he's been a marvelous partner to me, which I thought was interesting as well, the way he phrased it, that he was humble about his own contribution and very flattering about Warren's contribution to the relationship. And he said, we have a simple approach to relationships, where he said, if you want a good partner, be a good partner. And likewise, he said the same thing about marriage. He said, if you want to have a good spouse, deserve one. And so I think that's very revealing, that so much of Charlie's happiness and success has been built on good relationships. And the relationships stem from his own behavior, his own emphasis on ethics, on decency, on fairness. And so there's a wonderful thing from Buffett that he writes in the foreword to Janet Lowe's biography of Munger, which I think is called Damn Right, where Buffett writes this introduction. He says something along the lines of, in 43 years or 41 years or whatever it was then, he said, I've never seen Charlie try to take advantage of anybody. He said, I've seen him again and again take the worst end of the deal knowingly and take less of the credit than he deserves and more of the blame when things go wrong. And that's a really interesting insight, that his life has been built on these super successful relationships. And so at a certain point, I think he realized that even though he's one of the cleverest guys alive, he realized that Buffett was probably a better moneymaker than him. And so he was able to subordinate himself, despite being one of the cleverest guys alive, to Buffett and become the junior partner in this relationship. I think that's very interesting. So that gives you some clues about what makes for a successful and happy life. So much of it is built on relationships. And Ed Thorpe said something very similar to me when I asked him if you're playing the game of life as opposed to the game of investing or the game of blackjack or roulette, which he figured out how to win. What would you do? And he said, well, look, the single most important thing is who you spend your time with. That's really going to be the determinant of whether you have a happy and successful life. And so I think you're getting clues from these great investors as you reverse engineer their lives to see what works in business and what works in life. And so having honorable, decent, equitable relationships is absolutely key, partly because you draw such good people into your life when you behave that way. And I see that with Monish as well. If you listen to my recent interview with Monish on my podcast, we talk about this at length, that so much of his success is built on his relationships, and his relationships, what he's done is just draw these incredibly high quality people into his life by behaving ethically. And it sounds like such a simple thing, but I don't think truth tends to be that complicated. And so when you look at someone like Charlie, he has this incredible ability to simplify and to say, so if you want a good spouse, deserve one. If you want a good partner, be one. And so as with investing, Charlie says, it's simple, not easy. These truths are not that complicated, but when you discover them, you want to go big on them.
Actually, I want to bring in the another topic and then talking about concentration, right? So you said go 1000% into it if you like something, some idea, somebody, whatever. And then you have this concept of diversification as well in investing, right? So people say, have a diversified portfolio, but some of the great investors are actually a lot into concentration, right? I think you wrote about Joe Greenblatt. He invests only in 6-8 stocks. Nick Sleep, 70% of his wealth into, like, say, just Amazon. How do we balance this concept of the whole concentration and diversification?
I think there's a tremendous tension there. And to outperform, I do think it's tremendously helpful to concentrate. If one of the things Monish figured out very early on in his career, when he started to reverse engineer Warren and Charlie, is he said, I could see that Warren was basically laying out the laws of investing, like the laws of physics. And he said it was unbelievable to realize that all of these other investors, including all of these professional money managers, were just ignoring the laws of investing. He's like, it's like people saying that gravity doesn't exist. And he's like, you're going to fall to the ground, whether you like it or not, whether you believe it exists or not. And so one of the things that he was saying is, look, all of these guys own 200 positions and they buy them at really excessive prices. How can you find 200 things that are going to double? How can you find 200 things that are really cheap? So Monish's view is that what you wanted to do was follow Charlie Munger's approach, which is to say, let's be like a spear fisherman behind a stream, where you basically wait for a fat, juicy salmon to swim by, you spear it, and then you go back to doing nothing for maybe 6 months, maybe 2 years, until another fat, juicy salmon swims by. So it's an approach of tremendous selectivity and tremendous patience. And then Monish's view is, well, let me put maybe 10% in each position. And so maybe you own 10 stocks and that's diversified enough. But there have been times where Monish would have most of his money in 2 or 3 stocks, I think. And I think for most of us, that's just kind of suicidal. And so if you have a temperament like Monish and an intellect like Monish, you can probably get away with being exceptionally concentrated. But there's a much greater risk of you flying the plane into the side of the mountain. And so I think that when I look at the greatest investors, they've solved this problem. They've resolved this tension in very different ways. So there's a guy called Fred Martin, who I write about, who's a very interesting guy, or fascinating guy, who's built a very successful career over about 50 years as an investor. And he would have these simple rules where if I remember rightly, he wouldn't allow himself to put more than 3 or 5% in any position at purchase price, but then he would let them ride for many, many years. And so his average holding period was 10 years. And so he owned maybe 40, 45 stocks. And his view was that was concentrated enough so that he would survive and beat the market at the same time, not so concentrated that he would fly the plane into the side of the mountain, which is an apt analogy, because he is a pilot. And so he's taking that same mindset of being absolutely determined to survive catastrophe that he applies as a pilot. Then there are other people like Tom Gaynor, who has about 100 positions, but almost all of the money is in the top 20, and much of it is in the top 10. And so there's a balance between concentration and diversification. And so I just think you need to be self-aware. You need to know, am I really so smart that I believe that I can concentrate? Can I handle the vicissitudes of the market and stay in the market even when it gets killed? Or Bill Miller said to me recently, talked to me about how you just have to invest down to your sleeping point. And so if it's for Bill has more than 80% of his net worth in Bitcoin and Amazon, both of which he bought, so ridiculously cheap that, he said my cost basis is effectively zero for both of them. Bill can handle that pressure. And also, he's so rich, it doesn't really matter anyway. I would have a heart attack if I were in that position. So, yep. So you've got to invest in a way that suits your temperament and your personality. And I think it's also really helpful to ask this question that Jeffrey Gundlach, who's known as the king of bonds, yep. Asked. He said to me, you given that even the greatest investors are wrong about a third of the time, possibly half the time, he said, do you want to ask, what's the consequence if I'm wrong? And that's a really powerful question. It goes back to the question to my mentality when I was driving home, wondering, or not driving home, wondering if I was drunk. It's saying, what's the consequence if I'm wrong? So let's say you decide that Bitcoin is unbelievable and you put 120% of your portfolio in it. So you're leveraging up and you're like, yeah, I've discovered this amazing thing and I'm going to put everything in it. Maybe you're right, but what's the consequence if you're wrong? And I think that's a very, very wise precaution. Always to be focused on the downside. And I think we've seen that in the last few weeks, right? Where all of these people who were suffering from overconfidence, who looked incredibly smart over the last few years, suddenly look so foolish and so exposed.
Talking about the current market, right? I think it wrote about Matthew McLennan, right? Who said, the mistakes we all make is that we forecast the next period is going to behave in the same way as the previous one, which is rarely true, right? I mean, we are seeing that now. We've seen retail investors putting a lot of money into the market, continue to put in money, thinking that those growth stocks or the tech stocks will continue to do well, but now they're all like down 70-80%. How do the great investors think of the market cycles, right? Think through all this calmness, chaos. How do they think through the period?
I think it really goes back to one of the fundamental teachings of Ben Graham, Buffett's teacher, which is you want to make the market your servant, not your master. And so when the market gets crushed and is very tumultuous, you're looking at it saying, wow, so many fat, juicy salmon swimming in the stream right now for me to spear. And so you have to, so you're taking advantage of the volatility because you've positioned yourself during the good times so that you'll survive the difficult times. And so you can actually take advantage of the turmoil and the intense emotions that are caused by these periods of turmoil. So it requires you to be very independent minded during the times when everyone is getting carried away. You're saying, well, can't really find any bargains. Nothing seems cheap. And so let me maintain my discipline. And then when the market goes crazy and everyone else is in a panic, I'll be able to take advantage. So one of the things I write about in this chapter about Sir John Templeton is that the greatest investors are non-tribal. They most of us really want to be part of the herd. We tend to find comfort in crowds. And so the average investor, the average regular investor, sees everyone panicking at a period like this, and they panic too, or they can't, even if they don't panic and sell, they can't bring themselves to buy because it's just too painful to go against the herd. But this guy, Francois Rochon, who's a very smart Canadian investor, said to me that the greatest investors lack the tribal gene. And so someone like Buffett, according to my friend Jason Zweig, who's a very good personal finance columnist at the Wall Street Journal, Jason has this wonderful phrase where he says, Buffett is actually inversely emotional, that he's getting excited at these moments when everyone else is panicked, that he's looking at all the opportunities suddenly created by all of the turmoil and is getting excited. So it requires a certain type of temperament. You need to know yourself. I think it's helpful to look at how you've reacted in past periods and of turmoil. And one of the things that I'm doing myself is I'm looking at myself and I'm aware that in the past, I am contrarian and I've always bought during periods of turmoil, whether it was, the spring of 2020 or late 2008, early 2009. But I've pretty consistently been too early and then got hit as it went down further. And so I'm just sort of thinking about it this time. I'm like, do I want to buy now, or am I just gonna, because obviously things are cheaper, or am I just falling into the same trap as in the past where I bought things too early, then they got killed more? And so it's just looking at yourself and knowing what your patterns of behavior are. But at the very least, I know that I'm not going to do something stupid and panic and sell out. So even if I'm not smart enough or courageous enough to buy, at least let me not be stupid enough to sell, because I know that in the long run the market is very likely to go up, that as the world becomes more productive, as the economy grows, technological innovation comes along, it's likely to rise over the long term. And so you want to take advantage of these periods of turmoil to add to strong positions. But I also know one of the great lessons that I've learned from working on the book is that I'm not really qualified to analyze individual stocks. One of the things that I learned from Joe Greenblatt is, again, you want to play games that you can win. And Joe Greenblatt, who averaged 40% a year for 20 years, an incredible investor, said to me that most people simply shouldn't be buying individual stocks because they don't know how to value them. And so in the past, I would have looked at this period and I would have thought, let me buy some incredibly cheap stock that one of these great investors is buying. And now I'm looking at it, I'm like, why? Let me be honest about my own limitations. The fact that I don't really want to be sitting dispassionately in a room finding a bargain at the moment. So let me give money to somebody else who's better at doing that, who's unemotional. Or let me just add to the 2 index funds that I've owned for the last 20-something years. So we know the general rule that you don't want to panic in a moment like this. You don't want to follow the crowd. You don't want to sell. You want to add. But you also have to play the game in a way that suits you, I think, and not overestimate your ability to pick individual stocks or time the market. And this, again, it's one of the most obvious lessons of all, one of the most obvious standard stupidities to avoid is we know that we can't really predict the direction of the market. We can't predict the direction of the economy. We don't know how fast growth is going to be. We don't know what inflation is going to be like. So stop fooling yourself into thinking that you can predict this stuff. And all of these people who claim that they can predict it on the TV or in your newspaper, they're either lying to you or lying to themselves. And if they get lucky and they're right, then they'll market it for years. And they'll bury all of the times when they made stupid mistakes and were totally wrong. So I think just knowing that game is kind of useless. The prognostication game is utterly useless. People like Charlie Munger just say, well, I'm not making any market predictions. All they're looking for is a cheap stock where you're getting more than you pay for. And so that's the fundamental principle here at play is you're using periods like this to see whether the baby is getting thrown out with the bathwater. And so you're saying, what's being mispriced amid the chaos and the fear and the volatility? And that's what the greatest investors are doing. They're just quietly and dispassionately standing by the side of the stream with their spear saying, oh, thank you, Mr. Market. That's what you're giving me right now. And so I think you just have to be aware of whether that's your temperament and whether you have the skills to do that. And if not, give the money to someone who's better at doing it, who's better suited, or index the money. But I think also very important to bear in mind the advice that Sir John Templeton gave me, which is, he said, why should you be so arrogant as to believe that you can pick the one fund, the one fund manager, the one country, the one market, the one currency? And so again, one of the most powerful lessons is just to hedge against your own overconfidence, your own hubris, your own arrogance, and to say, I don't know. If Charlie Munger can be as wrong as he's been about Alibaba so far, which I own as well because of Charlie Munger, if Buffett could make such a huge mistake with Dexter shoes, if Templeton, who came top of his class at Yale while working full time, and then got a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, and then was the greatest global stock picker of the 20th century, could look back on his career and tell me, I've been wrong at least a third of the time with over 500,000 investment decisions I've made. I've been wrong over a third of the time. If they can be that wrong, think how wrong I am. And so I have to hedge against my own stupidity and self-delusion and belief that I can predict the future. So diversification is just a huge, it's one of those free gifts. But then if you diversify too much, then you're dooming yourself to mediocrity. But I'm perfectly happy to be mediocre with my index funds and just capture the rising market over time. So at least I want that to be part of my portfolio. And then I want to own a couple of funds run by people who I actually believe might be able to beat the market over time. And we'll see if that's just delusional. It may turn out to be delusional on my part and theirs.
Yeah. So actually, that was my next question, asking about your own investing style. So you actually covered a decent part of that in your answer. I just want to ask one thing. I mean, you've seen and you've met a lot of people, and you've seen what they invest in. You've read about them. You've interviewed them. Do you want to talk about any particular investing or investments that any particular person has done that has really fascinated you?
I think Nick's sleep is very remarkable, and it's part of the Nick has a kind of wisdom to him and an ease to him. He's comfortable in his skin in a wonderful way, and part of what I like about studying Nick is it's this whole philosophy of investing that's totally consistent with the way that he lives his life. So Nick became obsessed, maybe in his late teens or early 20s, with Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, this very eccentric kind of memoir come novel by this guy Persig, that's an exploration of values. And so the novel talks all about quality, the pursuit of quality. So Nick takes this very abstract idea, this kind of nebulous idea about quality, and he starts to apply it in investing. And so he sets up this fund, Nomad, with Kay Sakari. It goes by the nickname Zach. And they start saying, what would happen if we apply this concept of quality to everything that we do? So for example, the way that we treat our partners, let's treat them in the highest quality way. So they kept, for example, changing the fee structure to make it less and less positive for him and Zach, and more fair to their clients. So at a certain point, they said, we're going to take our incentive fee and we're going to put it in a holding bucket. And so then if we underperform in the 5 years after that, it'll go back to our investors, to our limited partners. So at a certain point during the financial crisis, when Amazon had halved and they had an enormous position in Amazon and everything they owned was getting killed, they had this meeting in McDonald's, suitably lavish setting for this meeting. And they were like, we might not get paid for many years. Like, we're so deeply in the hole that we're basically working for free for our partners. And they were like, and that's great. There's total alignment of interest. There's total fairness here. And so this idea of quality ran through everything that they did. So for example, and look, the experiment turned out amazingly. They beat the market by something like 804 percentage points over 13 years. So they did brilliantly. But even the way they treated each other, they would initially, Zach said, well, let's just do it 50-50. We'll own the company, we'll own Nomad 50-50. That was the discussion. Should we do it 50-50? And Zach said, no, I want you to own 51% and I'll own 49%. And that way, if we ever have an argument, you'll decide. If we ever have a dispute, you'll decide. And so what Nick said to me is, when someone is handing you a loaded revolver and saying, here, shoot me if you want, you're going to behave really fairly and decently and honorably to that person. So he said the whole relationship was built on kindness. And so that, again, it's quality running through their relationship with each other, their relationship with their shareholders. Then at the age of something like 45, having made hundreds of millions of dollars for themselves and even more for their partners, they send back all of the capital to their investors. And they say, we're done with this. We cracked the game of investing. There's nothing left for us here. And now we're going to focus on giving the money back to society. And so for the last few years, their entire focus has been on figuring out how to give back the money to society in a way that has the most enduring value. So again, they're looking at long-term destinations. They're thinking, they had this lovely image where Nick said to me at one point recently that when they were running the fund, he wanted to think, if I'm sitting on a veranda in, say, 20 years' time, sharing a bottle of Chardonnay with a limited partner from our fund who invested in our fund all those years ago. I want to know that I treated this person equitably and fairly and decently and honorably. And what inputs do I need to get to that happy, sunny destination? And he said to me recently, we were chatting just on Zoom a few months ago, and he said, I'm doing the same thing with my philanthropy. He said, I'm thinking, I want to look back in 20 years' time and think, I gave that money away well. I did a good job giving that money away. And he said, I want to do it based entirely on an inner scorecard. I'm not doing it to impress or please anyone else. I'm doing it in a way that's true to who I am and true to my values. And so, again, it's taking this very simple principle of acting in a long-term way, thinking about long-term destinations and what will get you to the destination, and then subtracting all of the noise, all of the desire for external validation and congratulation, and just focusing on what matters. And so he has this tremendous discipline in terms of focusing on what matters, but at the same time, there's a kind of joyfulness to the way he operates in life. So when one of the things that he did when he quit the investment business and decided he was going to focus on giving the money back is he went on, I think it was something like a 3-week car rally from Beijing to Paris with his teenage daughter, Jess, in I think a 1950s Mercedes Pagoda that he owns, because he has these beautiful vintage cars. And so if you think about, they were going through Mongolia and stuff like that in this vintage car in this rally race. So that again, it's not like he's taken this vow of poverty and decided I've got to give all the money back to society and I'm going to live this joyless Calvinistic life where I'm just going to punish myself for being rich. He's like, no, he's spending time with his daughter. He's got 3 daughters, very close to them. He's got this hobby of racing cars. There's something exuberant and joyful about it. And at the same time, he's very thoughtful about what's actually going to create a high quality life for him. And he knows that giving back to society is the second half of his life. So I find that very, very, very inspiring. It makes me think a lot about how to live my own life. And I'm not expecting to do anything like he's achieved, but at least it makes me think, what can I remove? What nonsense can I remove? What actually is the long-term destination? And it's a very good filter, because then you start to say, a project comes along, say there's pressure, for example, where everyone says, oh, you've got a successful book and you've got a successful podcast, so you should be big on YouTube. And I start to think, yeah, I should really set up a YouTube channel, and maybe I will at some point. And I'm like, but I'm kind of technologically incompetent and I'm already thin spread. And why do I need more complexity in my life? Let me focus on what I'm doing already. And so it's just a helpful filter. Or you think of the idea of quality and you think, well, there's all this pressure. People say you should set up a Substack blog and you should be blogging once a week. And I'm like, why? Why shouldn't I commit to doing more quality work at a time when so much rubbish is being pumped into the world constantly, so much bogus information, so much superficial stuff? Why shouldn't I try to focus more, to the best of my ability, on creating content that has enduring value? Why is it inappropriate to spend 5 years on a book instead of pumping out articles? So I'm not trying to be moralistic about it. I'm just applying those filters to myself and saying, what would a more quality focus be like in my life? What would a long-term destination be for me? What do I want to be in 20, 30 years? And the more I can remove the nonsense, the better. And I look at Nick and I can just see, there's someone who's actually doing it, who's actually living by these principles.
Awesome. So your book is called, Richer, Wiser, and Happier, and glad to hear that it's getting translated into 22 languages, including Gujarati, Hindi, and Marathi. So I'm, you've definitely interviewed people who are rich and wise. How is their happiness quotient?
Yeah, I didn't want to fall into the delusion of thinking that if you're rich, that means you're happy. Of course, that's nonsense. But I think there are very interesting clues that you can learn from the lives of these very pragmatic, very rational thinkers about what it takes to have a happy life. And one of the things that's most consistent, we spoke before about the emphasis on relationships, that's absolutely critical to happiness. Another thing that's absolutely critical is this aspect of sharing that you see running through the lives of someone like Nick Sleep, who we just spoke about, but also people like Munger and Buffett, who are giving away a fortune. You see them as teachers, right? Think about the amount of time Munger and Buffett have spent teaching, sharing wisdom, sharing their insights, sharing their time. You see also a tremendous emphasis on, I would say, ethical behavior. It's very interesting to see, if you listen to the interview that I just did with Monish, the emphasis on being ethical, on having integrity, on living life honorably is kind of extraordinary. And again, it draws very high quality people into your orbit. But I think it also makes you feel better about yourself, better about who you are. So that, I would say, is pretty consistent in the happiest people I've seen among these greatest investors. The way that they share is striking. I think if all you're doing is stockpiling money, buying Ferraris, buying palatial homes, we all know that it's of limited utility at a certain point, that there are diminishing returns. But at the same time, I didn't want to make out that money is unimportant, because I've been through situations where, for example, during the financial crisis, when I got laid off as editor of the European, Middle East, and African edition of Time, I felt that terror of, what if my industry has died? What if the magazine business is totally dead? And I'm 40 years old at that point, I think I was 40 years old. What if I can't take care of my two kids who were in private school in England? And what if I had to yank them out of private school? What if I couldn't afford to live in, this beautiful home that we're living in London at the time? And that was pretty terrifying. And as it happened, it all turned out fine. And partly it turned out fine because I didn't have any debt. And so I was able to ride out that storm, because I was sufficiently pessimistic about the future of the journalism world that I was like, I need to set myself up so I can survive whatever happens. And so that meant I didn't even have to sell any stocks to get through that very rough period in my life and in the world. But it really reminded me that it's not enough just to say, well, yeah, a happy life is all about love and relationships and rainbows and sharing. It's like, no, you want to have financial security. You don't want to be worried about the next bill. You want to be able to make sure that your kids are okay and you're going to be okay in retirement. And so I was trying to, in the epilogue of the book, I was trying to get that nuance right, to give a sense of what the money gives you and what it doesn't give you, and what actually constitutes a successful and abundant life. So I would say that the most important thing that the money gives the greatest investors I've interviewed is independence. It gives them the ability to live in a way that's true to who they are. And I think that's immensely valuable, to be able to say what you think, do what you think, not take on projects that you dislike with people you dislike, and feel, I took a job after I got laid off from Time magazine that I was so happy to have, because it kind of saved me in the middle of the financial crisis, but I hated that job. And I felt like a trapped rat, and leaving that job, quitting that job to go write books, was a real act of courage in some ways, faith that I could build a new career as an author. And it turned out to be a wonderful thing to do, but it was pretty terrifying at the time. But I was only able to do that, A, because I'd invested for many years, and B, because I'd lived within my means and had no debt. And so the money gave me this optionality. It gave me the freedom to say, I'm not going to work for people I dislike. I'm not going to work for bullies. I'm not going to take on projects that I dislike. I'm going to work with people I really like in future. And I'm going to be in control of my own time. For me, those things are immensely important. Those things are actually more important to me than being wildly rich. And, you know, for me to have control over my schedule and what I read and how I spend my time is very, very valuable. And I see that consistently with the greatest investors that I've interviewed. It's the freedom, the independence that really matters. So yeah, someone like Ed Thorpe said, look, I really like my Tesla. And I really like the fact that I own this house that overlooks the beach in California. And so I can go exercise on the beach. And I, you know, he's like, those things are not valueless. Those things, it's nice to be in a good environment. And even someone like Templeton, who would talk about, you know, well, your money is just for sharing. You're just a custodian of your money. It's like, yeah, that's all very well for you to say. You live in a beautiful house in the Bahamas overlooking the ocean. And so it's not accidental that he picked a nice environment. So I think your environment matters, your physical environment. It's nice to be in a good physical environment. The fact that you're not subject to the stress of the next bill coming, and the fact that you can live in a way that's true to who you are. Those are all great gifts of money. But then we do know that that's only going to take you so far, that you've got to build in sharing, you've got to have good relationships, and possibly most important of all, you've got to work on your own inner equanimity. And so when I think about the great investors, all of them have figured out how to create some form of emotional stability in their lives so that during the difficult periods, they're going to be able to handle it. They're going to get through. They're going to be able to think more dispassionately. And I do think they tend to be fairly unemotional in terms of their wiring, but there are clearly things that you can do to give yourself more equanimity, whether it's for someone like Templeton, it would have been prayer and exercise. For a lot of them meditate. But I think, you know, for some of them, for someone like Bill Miller, it's studying philosophy and studying things like Stoicism and pragmatic philosophy and taking ideas from philosophy. But he also studied Buddhism a great deal over many years. And so again, these ideas of focusing on what you can control, not what you can't. And so that again was another really key lesson for me in terms of happiness from the greatest investors, was to say, well, when I'm thinking of those key buckets that I have to focus on in my life, the key areas, I can't neglect anything that builds equanimity. And so having to think very consciously about whether that's walking in nature, spending time with your family and friends, meditating, exercising, it's not a luxury. And in the past, I think because I'm kind of maniacal about work, I would have thought, no, I can just sit around eating, drinking coffee and writing and thinking and talking. And you can get away with that when you're younger, maybe. And now that I'm in my 50s, I started to think, nah, I actually have to get on a Peloton bike a few times a week, much as I dislike exercise. And I have to meditate and stuff. And so I'm not super religious and disciplined about these things, but I know that they're really important. And I also really take seriously a lesson from Guy Spear, which is that part of constructing a calm and happy life is to focus on having really good relationships with your family, with your wife, with your kids, with your friends. And so again, it's very easy to neglect that stuff if you're maniacal about your work, but to know that having a healthy ecosystem in which you can think clearly and have emotional resilience, to know that actually depends on the quality of your relationship with your family and your friends is very helpful, because then instead of thinking it's a side issue that you can neglect, you start to say, no, it's central. It's one of the 3 or 4 things that I have to focus on in life.
That brings us to this last question, which, you know, I ask every one of my guests. What advice will you give to your 20-year-old self?
I think I've spent so much of my life trying to win external approval, trying to prove to the world that I was smart and charming and talented and all of these things. And so I think, you know, growing up in England, going to posh schools like Eton and then Oxford, and then coming here to New York, to Columbia, and going to work at Time magazine, writing for the New Yorker and stuff like that. It was all great, but it was all driven by a desire to impress other people and make myself feel better, because other people would look at me and say, wow, look, he's so smart, he's so talented. And I think that's a very fragile foundation on which to build a life. You can be very successful at it, but it doesn't necessarily make you happy. And so I think one of the great lessons that Buffett taught Monish and Guy when they had this $650,000 charity lunch back in probably 2008 was he talked to them about this whole idea of the inner scorecard, living by an inner scorecard. And one of the things that Buffett has said that's a lovely way to express it is to say, you have to ask yourself, would you rather be the best lover in the world, but known publicly as the worst, or the worst lover in the world, but known publicly as the best? And I think when I look at the investors I admire, they're living by an inner scorecard. They're not saying, let me get approval from the world to prove to myself that I'm valid. They're trying to behave by their own tough standards. I think it would have been helpful to know that, but it may be that you have to make these mistakes yourself, and you have to be chasing after the wrong thing for many years in order to realize that it didn't work, and then say, all right, well, that was a failure, so let me try to reorient it. So I think when I hit about 40 and I'd become really pretty successful, like I'd been around the world, editing international magazines and writing for the greatest publications and interviewing presidents and prime ministers. I felt kind of self-important. And then when I got laid off from Time, it was suddenly like, well, that wasn't me. That wasn't my reputation. That was Time magazine got me to go interview Manmohan Singh, or to go interview David Cameron, or travel all, when I went to India to, I would be escorted by people through customs and put up in beautiful hotels. You feel very self-important. I would sit 5 feet away from Manmohan Singh, looking in his eyes and thinking, God, his eyes are so sad. You're in these extraordinary positions, and you think you're successful and that it's you. But there's something very brittle, very fragile about that focus on other people's approval. And so I think, I don't know if any of this makes any sense, but I think I wish I had known the degree to which that wouldn't satisfy me. Yeah. And that the things that end up building satisfaction are more along the lines of, all of this stuff sounds so superficial and so bland and kind of platitudinous when you say it, except that it happens to be true. So I remember at one point I became kind of friendly with Tony Robbins, who's this kind of legendary business strategist and life coach and the like. And I said to him at one point, so if I've always been driven by fear and anxiety and a desire to impress the world, and if I dismantle that, what am I left with? What drives me then? And there's sort of a silence, and I sort of look at him and I'm like, service? And he looks at me and it's like, yeah. And he just sort of nods his head, and it's like, oh, really? Damn it. Like I've got to focus more on serving others instead of just trying to impress people with, academic credentials or magazine credentials, or, and so it's very platitudinous to realize that service is ultimately what's going to make you happier. But it happens to be true. And so there's this great paradox, I guess, how behavioral psychologists, behavioral finance people talk about the hedonic treadmill, right? Where you get on this hedonistic treadmill where you're like, more donuts, more fame, more validation, more money, more love, more admiration, more women, more men, more cars. And so it's this hedonic treadmill where you're trying to fill this gaping hole, this desire to be loved and admired and to feel worthy. And it never really fills that hole. And so the great the great paradox is that when you start focusing more on helping other people, on serving other people, you do become happier. And so I think I was chasing the wrong thing. But if I hadn't chased it and seen how bankrupt it was and how bogus it was and experienced that for myself, I don't think I would have learned the lesson. So I could try to teach myself, my 20-year-old self, that lesson, but I don't think I would have heard it. And I don't think I would have operated by it. It's kind of like an alcoholic reaching, or a drug addict getting to the bottom and realizing, oh yeah, this way of living isn't working, and then deciding to change. So I think I had to discover the bankruptcy of the hedonic treadmill, the longing for approval, admiration, and I think part of what's wonderful is that I see people like Monish or Guy Spear or Charlie or Warren becoming better and better people. And you can see them all working on themselves and deepening and serving more. It was very clear to me when I talked to Monish recently. In my interview with him, I was asking him about how he had changed, because I could see that when we were in Omaha together this last time, there was a gentleness and a kindness to the way that he behaved. And he talked about how he realized that weekend, he should just be there to serve mankind. And he said, there are all these people who don't have access to Warren and Charlie, who are friends of his. And he's like, if they want to come up and take a photo with me and be seen with me and ask me a question, I'm there for them. And so what I'm seeing there is Monish making this same discovery for himself, that it's not enough just to have the Ferrari and the beautiful cars and the beautiful home and all of the adulation. All of that stuff is nice. And it's not like, none of us are saints. And I still think Monish probably likes the adulation, and Warren likes being on the stage in Omaha, having everyone admire him. We all have an aspect of ego lingering there, probably to greater degree in many of our cases. But that understanding that the shift towards service and towards helping others is more likely to make you happy, that's a huge revelation. And I don't think it's an accident that there's a kind of joyfulness to Warren and Charlie that comes from sharing wisdom, sharing insights, sharing their fortunes. They've tapped into a very powerful truth in life. So I was chasing the wrong thing. And I wish I had known that earlier, but I think actually I needed to get crushed to discover it. And so I needed kind of humiliation of getting laid off by time, having the fear of, would I be able to support my family? Is my career finished? Am I done? To say, well, my previous way of operating didn't really work. It got me so far, but there's got to be a better way. And so I think you could kind of come out of a crisis like that somewhat nihilistic, and you could say, well, it's all political. It's all, why was I laid off when I was so good at my job, and poor me? And instead I came out and I was like, let me try to build a better life that's on a stronger foundation. And so partly studying the greatest investors has been my way of re-educating and rewiring myself to say, oh, that works. And so when I look at Nick Sleep, I look at Tom Gaynor, I look at Arnold Vandenberg, I end the book with, look at Warren, Charlie, Monish, I see people who are serving others in some way. And that's a very beautiful thing, right? It's one of the great paradoxes of life, that the less it's about your own ego, the freer and happier and more influential in some sense you are, that they're having an impact on the world, not because it's all about them and satisfying their own ego, but because they're helping others. That's a very powerful and profound discovery. And to see it playing out in the lives of so many extraordinary people offers a very powerful validation for that idea. So I've seen it myself, that living just to satisfy my own ego and to impress other people didn't work. But I'm also seeing the same pattern in all these other lives. And so I think what I would encourage your listeners to do is just, again, as Charlie said, you observe what works and doesn't work and why. And so as you look at your own life, you think, well, when I was just out for myself and for trying to impress people or trying to fill this hole with more possessions and more money or stuff, did it actually work? And it may have worked for a while, but ultimately, I think it leaves you feeling a little bit empty. And then you think about, how did I feel when I helped people? How did I feel when I actually was of service? And then you're like, oh yeah, that kind of worked. And so this isn't about being sanctimonious and pious and self-righteous. I think one of the things that I love in observing people like Monish is that he's so not sanctimonious and self-righteous. He's a game player and he's just playing the game and he's saying, this is how you win the game. And so the way you win the game is I think, ultimately probably by overcoming your own ego and serving others. And I have an enormous distance to go, but I'm encouraged by the fact that when I look at Charlie at 98, Warren at 91, Monish at 56, 57, and all of these other people, I can see the progress that they've made in overcoming their own ego and serving others. And that makes me think, okay, at least that's the direction that I want to go in, and that I think is more likely to lead to happiness than the direction that I was on at 20 of just trying to impress the world and convince them that I was great. Does that make any sense?
No, I think make total sense. I mean, there is a Vedantic philosophy, which says that we associate a lot with what is happening to us to ourselves. Right? While we actually, but you are not, there is a Sanskrit thing called Tattvamasi. Basically the God is within you. And we associate ourselves with our body, with our soul, with our everything, though you're actually something else. You're not that body, you're not that soul. And, so I think it comes to that point that, the ego is getting associated with something which probably doesn't even belong to you. I think, and I really loved it. I just want to push my luck, and I have this last thing to ask you. You meet up with all these rich people, famous people, you dine with them, you travel with them, you said you spend time with Manmohan Singh. Doesn't it get to your head? And how do you bring back to your own self, your own humility? How do you make sure that you come back to that?
Yeah, it doesn't go to my head at all. It was funny. I was having this conversation. Well, I don't think so anyway. I had this conversation with my daughter a few weeks ago where I was saying this podcast is doing really well, and I get all these amazing messages, and it's kind of crazy. Like after all the years of being a journalist, where you get kind of no external validation, right? You tend to work for a tough editor who doesn't say anything nice ever, and nobody writes to you or tells you how great you are. Suddenly, I was like, everyone's telling me how great I am. And my daughter said, is it going to your head? And I'm like, no, I don't think so. I think there's still so much self-doubt and self-loathing and an insecurity that it hasn't, maybe it's got me closer to sort of a neutral level rather than me walking around thinking, God, I'm so fantastic. But I also think you spend a lot of time with these extraordinary people and you start to see the gap between their behavior at their best and your behavior. And you start to be like, oh God, really? I'm still like that. I'm still doing stuff like that. That's still, and so in some ways it is kind of humbling. You see all of the areas in which you're still selfish and still irrational. And so, no, I don't think it's made me more arrogant to spend time with great investors. I think it's I feel very fortunate. I mean, there's something really wonderful about something like a 2-hour conversation with Monish for my podcast, where we're actually getting to discuss these really serious issues about how to live and how to think and what he's learned from Charlie and Warren and Li Lu. That's an incredible privilege. So I feel that sense of gratitude and appreciation and responsibility that comes from it. But I also feel kind of tired. There's also this sense of how do you keep this up? How do you sustain interviewing all of these people and keep sharing ideas and keep so far from it being a source of self-congratulation, I think it actually triggers a lot of the old vulnerabilities and insecurities of like, yeah. So the very first person I interviewed on my podcast was Ray Dalio, and then I have like people like Bill Miller and Howard Marks and Joe Greenberg. And so I could be sitting there thinking, God, this is fantastic, I'm amazing. And instead I'm like, what if I can't sustain this? What if I can't get other really good guests? And so there's always this sense of insecurity. And I don't know, I think you can change these characteristics, you work on them and you improve, but I still think you're working with a basic set of characteristics of insecurity or vulnerability or overconfidence or arrogance or whatever. And I take heart from, there's a great Kabbalist called Rav Ashlag. Rav means teacher, who said it's a spiritual law that there's no negative characteristic you have that you can't change. I often think about that. I'm like, okay, so that's good. So if I'm still selfish in this way, or arrogant in this way, or self-loathing in this way, those are things I can work on and I can change. So no, maybe it would be better if this stuff went to my head and I became more full of myself. In fact, it's just like, how can I keep going? Can I do this? Have I? What if I can never write another good book? What if I can? So it's hard. And again, it kind of goes back to the thing that I was saying about Bill Miller, that there's this assumption that if you're super rich and incredibly smart and incredibly well known, that you exist in this cocoon where everything is perfect and lovely. And it's like, no, we all suffer. We all have our insecurities. We're all vulnerable. We're all fearful. We all feel we disappointed our teacher or our parent, or and I think that's very heartening to know in some way that we're all kind of deeply vulnerable and a little bit confused and trying to muddle our way through life. And in some ways, what I've been trying to do, both with my book and with my podcast and in every area of my life, is to grope my way through the dark, through the fog, and to figure out what people who are smarter than me have figured out already. And so that's why I read so much in all of these different areas. It's why I interview people. So I think maybe the reason people connect to what I've written is that I'm not saying, look how smart I am, I figured this out. It's like, look how ignorant and confused I am. And these people are kind of guiding me through the dark. And so I have skin in the game. I'm trying to figure out how to live, how to get by, how to live a better life, how to become a better person, how to become more honest, more honorable, have more integrity, how to become kinder, how to become more loving, And so it all comes from a recognition of my own frailty and imperfection. And so I take great heart from seeing great investors who've worked on themselves and improved. So I was very struck at the recent annual meeting for Berkshire in Omaha, where Buffett talked about, if you've been fairly successful, you really want to become a better person in the second half of your life. I could see him, in some ways, there's something confessional about that. There's something where he's saying, I screwed up in all of these ways in the first half of my life, and maybe I should have been a better father or a better husband. And he figured out at a certain point that he needed to become more lovable and kinder. And so when I see the actions where he does incredibly kind things to friends of mine, whether it's letters of support or just these small acts of kindness where he'll send letters congratulating them on something, whether it's Monish or Guy or others. I'm like, that's Warren improving. Here's this 91-year-old guy who's discovered increasingly the power of service and kindness. And so I think that gives me great hope. It makes me, so I'm really looking at these great investors, not as perfect human beings, but as very flawed individuals like us, working on themselves and trying to become better. I look at Charlie the same way. When I went to the Daily Journal meeting and I see the way he's treating these disciples who've come to see him from around the world, I see the kindness he shows to them. I'm like, oh, that's love. Here's this guy who's famously brusque and famously rude. And at the age of 90 something, he's become kind and loving to these people. That's incredible. That's a person who's worked on himself and changed and improved, and that gives all of us hope. So this is how I synthesize the stuff from the greatest investors. It's about how to play the game and make money and become financially independent and financially secure. But it's also about how to live. It's about observing what works and doesn't work and why.
Thank you so much, William. It's been an awesome conversation. Thanks a lot for taking my cold call and agreeing to do this. Thanks a lot for all those 25 years of work and sharing with the world. So I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. It's so a real much. Pleasure. And you asked great questions. They're very good questions. You can see there were a couple of questions where I had to pause and I'm like, oh God, how do I answer this? So that's a sign of a good host and a good questioner. So thank you.
And then that's a sign of humility as well. So thank you so much on that note. Thank you.
It's been a real joy. Thanks.